content. So we're continuing today, or finishing up the year on the Mentoring Works live webinars, with another topic that is vitally connected to people performance, and that is motivation. I've titled this one Motivation More Than a Reason. Today's content, as every webinar this year, has come to you from my book, Advanced Mentoring Skills, Taking Your Conversation to the Next Level. It's more than a book. When you purchase this book, you get access to 12 video masterclasses as well. So our topic is motivation. And I think we've come a long way since the carrot and the stick philosophy of motivation. Although there's still something in that, and there's still some people who try to treat us like donkeys. Hopefully I can share some more sophisticated motivational ideas with you today. So in this webinar, I'm going to be talking about, before we even start to think about motivation, we need to make sure that people's basic needs are met. And I'll talk about why and how. I want to talk about what gets in the way of performance, and how we actually engage the drivers of motivation and how we build those so that we get the sort of performance or the sort of behaviors that we want from people around us and indeed ourselves. So when we talk about motivating people, we usually mean that we want to get them to think, feel, or do something differently. Sometimes the person we want to change is ourselves, and most of us who've tried know it's usually not that easy to change. Now, the dictionary talks about motivation as providing a reason to act in a certain way. And I've called this webinar More Than a Reason. So the dictionary definition is about reason, because they talk about being motivated as having strong reason to accomplish something, and something that motivates us as an inducement, an incentive. And these definitions assume that we make conscious, rational decisions to act in certain ways. But I believe, and the research supports this view, there's a lot more to it than that. Indeed, neuroscience has established that 99% of our behaviors, or what we do every day, is actually generated by unconscious aspects. We know, and if you think about this for a minute, you'll agree, we often act against our best interests. And emotion is at least as powerful as reason. So the 99% does include involuntary functions such as breathing, sweating, and digestion. These things happen automatically. But importantly, it also includes habits, the things that we do kind of on autopilot, the things we could decide to do differently, but basically just leave on that autopilot. And you know, if you've ever driven in your car and you've been going somewhere, somewhere you go regularly, a known route, you arrive at your destination safely, and then you realize you've got no memory of getting there. It's because all of, your directions were so automatic in your mind. You just drove and your mind was engaged elsewhere. You're basically on autopilot. And there are dozens of things we do every day that are just left to habit. We've learned these behaviors and then we've relegated them to our subconscious, so below that level of awareness, that can take care of things in order to free our conscious mind for thinking in real time. We often act against our best interests. Sorry, let me go back. If we were totally rational, we'd never overeat, drink too much, or smoke cigarettes or anything else. We'd exercise, we'd meditate, we'd manage our finances well and not get ourselves entangled in bad relationships. We wouldn't follow fashion or watch cat, dog, or goat videos online. There'd be no trolls, no inspiration, and no Kardashians. We'd never get upset by criticism or bask in praise. The head would rule the heart. There would be no heroes risking their lives to rescue others if we always acted in our best interest. And then the next point, that emotions are at least as much of an influence as reason in our conscious decisions. Now we'll get to our brain diagram here. See, what happens is we have the brain stem at the base of our skull here, joining to the spine. And that is where the input of sensory data, everything we touch, what we see, we smell, we taste, the sensory data that our body picks up feeds into our brain right at the base of the skull. And it triggers emotional reactions in the amygdala. And this is where our fight, flight, freeze, the threat, fear, instinct responds. It triggers. It triggers a primal survival response. Then a flood of neurochemicals causes us to actually see differently, process differently, act and behave differently. Now, this is not necessarily good or bad. We just have to understand that we act differently when our brains are flooded with these emotions. We do have what's called the executive function, where we self-regulate. This is the rational, where we make those rational choices, where we think and decide. But it kicks in more slowly. It's at the front of our skull, front of our brain here, the prefrontal cortex, which has the self-regulation function. Now, I have previously demonstrated to you something from Dan Siegel's work called the hand model. Do you want to play along with me here? So take your hand and tuck your thumb into your palm and then fold your fingers over that to actually make a fist. So when you do that, this becomes a model of the brain. So your fingers are representing this prefrontal cortex shown on screen, the executive function. Your wrist becomes the brain stem, feeding the sensory data up into your brain via the emotional centers of the brain. Now, Dan Siegel talks about this and actually teaches this model to parents and children. He has a dual focus. He's a pediatrician and he's a neuroscientist. And this model allows people to understand what's going on. He talks about flipping your lid. Now, we've all had this experience, you know, when something just drives you crazy, you have an argument or something your child does drives you crazy and you kind of lose it. And he shows this demonstration, because what happens is this is your executive function, your self-regulator has flipped open and exposes the amygdala, the emotional centers of your brain. So the emotions are in control at that moment. And by giving parents and children a language and a diagram to think about this and to understand what's going on, they can then start to calm down and communicate, and they both understand what's going on. And it's not just useful for parents and children. I think you can see some applications in your own life, and I'd love some feedback from you. And now, as I said, these sorts of things are natural functions, not necessarily good or bad, except when they get out of control. Because sometimes being passionate about a cause or standing up for a belief in face of opposition or persecution, being an activist or an advocate, may be based on emotions that energize and empower you. And as we'll see, a sense of purpose is a powerful motivator. It's just about learning to have choices and when it's appropriate to self-regulate rather than fly off into your emotions. Interestingly, back to the dictionary, the words motivation and emotion have the same Latin root, mot, to move. So if you want to motivate yourself or others, you cannot ignore the power of emotions. And indeed, Maslow's classic theory of human motivation recognized the power of emotions and still can be useful to understand motivation in the workplace. If basic needs for food and shelter are not met, for example, by adequate pay in the workplace, if people do not feel safe through disrespect, bullying, or harassment, if they do not feel like they belong because of racism, sexism, ageism, isolation, lack of friendliness in the workplace, if their esteem is not nurtured, so they're treated as low status, they lack recognition and attention, if they have no opportunity to accomplish their full potential, you are unlikely to be able to motivate them to be more productive or to behave or think or feel the certain ways that you would like them to. In fact, if the basic safety and belonging needs are not met, you can expect counterproductive behavior. If you want to motivate anyone, you must first find ways to help them feel safe emotionally as well as physically. For employees, this includes feeling they belong and are valued. I'm going to pause for questions now. You can type in to the question box there. Okay. So if you have questions, type them in. I shall pause again in a second. So we have talked about, before we even start to think about motivating ourselves or other people, we need to consider those basic needs that people have. If people's basic needs are not met, expect counterproductive behaviors. I next want to talk about, well, what gets in the way when you want people to do certain things? And this is whether you are a leader of a team, a manager, or indeed mentoring a mentee. You often want to inspire them or motivate them. But now we need to talk about, before we even get to some techniques for motivation, what gets in the way, what stops people doing the ideal situation. And mentoring is a perfect way to have collaborative conversations, to allow people to review the real world, what's going on for them really, and then talk about, well, what's the ideal situation and what is the gap between what's happening now in the real world and what is the ideal? What would you or they like to happen? Once you've identified there is a gap, there is an ideal situation, and it's not the same as what's going on in real life, then you can start to talk about, okay, what would need to change? And this is very much a two-way conversation. This is a collaborative review of the situation. The picture now, the picture of the ideal, what's wrong with the picture? What needs to actually change? And the conversation can then draw on their past experiences. What has worked for them in the past. And if they're limited in what they can come up with as a mentor or as a leader, it may be appropriate for you to share some of the strategies you've actually used in the past that you think perhaps might work for them, and get their ideas, get their input on that. Then consider some options based on those experiences and things that have worked in the past or you feel could work in future. Discuss the options and get the mentee to choose what they think they can actually implement in action. Come up with an action plan, and then your collaborative review has resulted in a plan that they can implement. And of course, you come back and review again. And this is something that you can do one-on-one or as a group. And next, I'm going to share a process that's really good to use as a group, one-on-one, or even by yourself. And some of you may be familiar with this. Kurt Lewin came up with an idea called force field analysis. It's very illuminating as a team process. And if you do this as a team, it will really engage them as they identify driving forces. So if we identify what the goal is, where we're trying to go, and then we can look at what's helping us get there or what will help us get there and what is holding us back. So the driving forces are factors that support, encourage, or propel people towards the desired situation. And the restraining forces are all the factors, the pressures, issues that restrict progress or prevent the desired situation. Once identified, you can work to reduce restraining forces and boost driving forces. To do a force field analysis, you'll need a space for the team to gather if you're doing it face-to-face. But these days, you can use these techniques online. I think one of the positive things that has come out of the last 2 or 3 years is our increased acceptance and utilization of the technology. So you can actually set up virtual whiteboards in Zoom. You can set up polls. You can set up all sorts of ways that you can gather information, even anonymously, in real time online. And I commend you to, if this is something that appeals to you, research the ways you can do that. Or if you're doing this already, I'd love you to share that. If you're willing to share with us, maybe type in the chat box, and I'll or you can unmute yourself in a moment and tell us your experience of this. So the idea is to do a force field analysis. You get the team together with some sort of whiteboard or flip chart on the wall, marker pens or technology, and you discuss and succinctly define the team outcome that you want to improve. And you write this as the desired situation. Now, remember, you can do this just by yourself. It works better when you've got one person to bounce off, and it works even better when you've got a group brainstorming situation. You then discuss and describe the current situation and list this on another chart. Brainstorm a list of the restraining forces. So what's holding you back or what's working against you, changing that and achieving the desired situation. And again, brainstorm and list the driving forces, the things that help or would increase the ability to accomplish the desired outcome. You can even illustrate the strength, the relative strength of each of these forces working for or against you. Give it a rating scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the strongest. Draw an arrow towards or away the outcome. Excuse me. Then you can have the team suggest actions that could increase each driving force and decrease the impact of restraining forces. So you're working on both sides of the equation here. So here is an example of the goal was a performance goal for a team. And in order to analyze that and come up with some strategies, they looked at, okay, what is restraining us from achieving this performance goal? Okay, technical competence, well, perhaps that's a little low. Competing priorities, people typically talk about time. Oh, we don't have time. I would suggest reframing that as competing priorities. You have all the time that is available. It's just that there are other things getting in the way. What are these competing priorities? Are they really a higher priority than the one you've listed? Other duties, people who are working part-time, sometimes that's an issue. Are the outputs that are required actually really clear? Maybe it's not clear what we should be achieving. How does the team actually work together? On the other hand, the things that are really helping us would be a clarity of what our priorities really are. If we had some guidance on, what's number one, what's number two, what's number three. Perhaps we can reassign some tasks. Maybe we can delegate, outsource, find a different way to do them. Some reassurance would really help us. We need to know when we're on track, when we're off track, positive feedback, perhaps some incentives, setting some milestones. So if it's a big goal, maybe we need to break that down into steps and stages, and technical training so that we actually have the technical competence. So I do urge you you can search online. Kurt Lewin is the source. There's plenty of information out there. It's a terrific technique that I do commend to you to use by yourself, in your mentoring, one-on-one, and in groups as well. And I think you'll get some real benefit from that. And if you're using it in a team, the engagement in the process can lead to change and satisfaction. So there's motivation in just doing that process. Of course, there has to be follow through. If you just do the process and it never goes anywhere, people will quickly become disillusioned, and it'll be much harder to engage them in future. But if you use it as a problem solving or a planning process, you can really build motivation. So I'm going to go back now and see if there are questions coming in. I don't see any, so I'm going to keep going. Do type in if you have a question, a comment. If you have some experience, if you've used this technique, I'd love to hear about that too. You can share. So next, I'm going to talk about building drivers. And this is where unfortunately, most workplaces are entrenched in the old carrot and stick method: rewards, bonuses, commissions for performance, and punishment for failure. And Daniel Pink wrote a fantastic book called Drive: The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. And in that, he shares the 7 deadly flaws of carrots and sticks, which I am going to outline here. And he says, and the research backs this up, incentives can actually extinguish intrinsic motivation. So the motivation that comes from within, if we're paid to do something we enjoy, it can turn play into work. Many replicated experiments have shown that rewarding subjects for a task they enjoy reduces their inclination to do it. This is a good reason not to pay mentors. And I've talked to many mentors who feel quite insulted by being offered pay for their work. And usually, what they do is priceless anyway. So pay is not a thing that mentors usually want, unless we're talking professional coaching and mentoring. Those who volunteer to mentor do so for altruistic reasons, and can be offended by rewards, and they may lose their enthusiasm. The second point Daniel Pink makes is offering incentives can actually diminish performances. Ask any farmer employing fruit pickers. The quality usually goes down as speed goes up, as they're driving themselves for those incentives. Incentives also can crush creativity. Artists commissioned and non-commissioned work were compared in this piece of research. So they looked at artists who'd been asked to paint or create a sculpture of a particular thing versus the work that artists did just from their own intrinsic motivation, and they compared. And though both artworks demonstrated the same level of technical competence, those that were paid to do it were less creative. Incentives can actually crowd out good behaviour. The experiment that is quoted in Daniel Pink's book gives the example of a childcare centre where some parents were late to pick up their kids. And so the childcare centre instigated a fine. So when parents showed up late, they were fined. And actually, what happened was it increased the number of people who were arriving late to pick up their kids. They thought, oh, well, I'll pay the fine, so it doesn't matter. I'm visiting Hong Kong for Christmas. I have family over there, and parking is very difficult, and parking stations are few and far between. And locals are known to park in illegal spots because it's cheaper to just pay the fine than to drive around and around or go so far to park in a designated spot. So it might be an incentive, in this case a negative incentive, but it often does not work. This point is one that comes home here in Australia very much so. Paying incentives can encourage cheating, shortcuts, and unethical behaviour. Here in Australia, we had a royal commission that exposed the extent to which paying bonuses and commissions for selling financial services and advice resulted in appalling behaviour by our major banks and investment companies. And that's a case of paying incentives backfiring in a big way. It can also become addictive. Gambling addiction occurs with small and infrequent rewards. Brain studies show that the area of the brain stimulated is the same as that associated with the high of drug addiction. On a more innocuous note, I suppose, try paying your child once for doing a chore, and they will not only expect payment next time, but they'll gradually want more and more payments from you. It also fosters short-term thinking. Rewarding your child for studying might get them the grade you want, but will not build any commitment or love of learning. So there are times, however, when pay for performance may work, and those are tasks that require no creativity and very little thinking at all. Boring, repetitive tasks that can be performed systematically, those are the tasks which you can do a pay for performance motivation and get a good result. So that's all a bit dispiriting, isn't it? All of our traditional ideas about motivation kind of tossed out and debunked. However, let's go back to Daniel Pink's book, where he shares decades of research on motivation. and explains why traditional motivation, including external rewards, seldom works. But he also spells out the 3 elements that do. Here they are. Autonomy, mastery, and a sense of purpose. As I describe each of these in a bit more detail, reflect on how you might use it in your situation, again, in mentoring or in leading a team. So let's look at autonomy. Some workplaces have had success in introducing a results-only work environment. Workers have no set work hours. They don't even have to come in to work as long as they get their work done. And I think, again, the last 3 years of enforced working from home has shown that not only do people get work done, they can be more productive working from home. Now, this idea of a results-only work environment probably is too radical to apply universally, but there are now millions of people who telecommute. There have always been self-employed people, again, farmers, artisans, entrepreneurs, who have produced without anyone managing them, and without that supervision. So the benefits of autonomy, and doesn't have to be working from home, there are other ways to introduce that, show that there can be higher productivity, enhanced persistence, less burnout, psychological well-being, and job satisfaction that leads to higher performance. And we just have to make sure that working from home does not become living at work. So work-life balance now means being able to close the door on work. And I know sometimes this can become a stressor for people that can't literally close the door, that don't have that decompression between leaving work and arriving at home. So it's another situation that needs to be managed in terms of our work-life balance. So what can we do as leaders, as mentors? Well, it can be about developing empathy. So being able to see issues from another person's perspective. So trying to stand in their shoes. It means giving meaningful feedback and having methods of getting people information that is feedback, that they're on track, that they're off track. Autonomy means giving people choices about what to do and how to do it, and encouraging people to take on new projects. So it's a whole style of leadership and communication, and it's a mentoring style of leadership, actually, that really allows people to have more autonomy in what they do. So I want you to think about now, and if you have some experience you might like to share, how have you or could you use the concept of autonomy at work or in mentoring? In what ways do people have choices about what they do and when or how they do it and with whom? I'm going to pause now so you can share some of your thoughts. And naturally, I just have to say that for autonomy to work in a team situation, the outcomes must be really clear and well defined so that people can be accountable and have a sense of achievement. So I'm wondering who has actually used this idea of giving people more autonomy, either in your mentoring or in your team leadership. Okay, I shall continue and I'll come back to comments as they come in. So the second point, so we've talked about autonomy. The second point that Daniel Pink makes is mastery. So mastery, means taking on an intellectual challenge. It's about self-efficacy. So being able to take on and do tasks. The way this benefits us is by building engagement, increasing people's capabilities. Again, it builds productivity. So here's a concept called the Goldilocks task. And basically it means, it's based on the idea that when people have tasks that exceed their capability, that creates anxiety. When they have tasks that are below their capabilities, it creates boredom. So it's about finding the sweet spot. So it's not too difficult and not too easy, so that we find the challenge that's just right for the person. So we want to stretch people, but not stretch them to the point of making them overly anxious. We want it to be a challenge, not a trial. So what can you do? Set those Goldilocks tasks. Know your people well and find that sweet spot, that just right spot. This can enrich their role if this is a team you're leading. And it also encourages the growth mindset. So the growth mindset says, I can learn skills. I can develop my knowledge. How I am now is not how I need to be tomorrow. What I was born with isn't going to be my total limitation in life. I can learn, I can grow. I have a growth mindset. And each time I stretch my abilities, I am learning, I am reinforcing that growth mindset. So I wonder what you do yourselves in your own mentoring practice that helps to do that. One of the things you can also do is to highlight people's progress, point it out to them, train them to recognize how far they've come. So in your mentoring conversations, ensure that you are reviewing and getting them to look back and see the progress that they've made. If they can't see it, then you can point it out to them. And in fact, support for making progress is one of the most impactful motivators there is. According to a multi-year study tracking activities, motivation, and emotions of hundreds of workers, the number one motivator is people feeling like they are getting somewhere. When they have support to overcome obstacles, their emotions are most positive and their drive to succeed is highest. When they feel they're spinning their wheels, getting nowhere, when they're blocked from meaningful accomplishment, moods and motivation are lower. Every small step in the right direction needs to be encouraged. That's how positive reinforcement works. So, mastery involves setting Goldilocks tasks, helping them to enrich their role, encouraging the growth mindset, and highlighting progress. The third element identified in Daniel Pink's book, we talked about in autonomy and mastery, it is that sense of purpose. People want to feel what they do makes a difference and is important. So you need to provide context, discuss the why of the goal. If it's the individual's goal, if you're mentoring, remind them or encourage them to talk about why this is important to them. Why did they set this goal in the first place? If this is an organizational context or a team context, what does it mean in terms of making the world a better place? How does it contribute to society? How are people's lives improved by the product or the service that you are collaboratively delivering. People want to be proud of where they work. It's your job to help them see how they can be. And then link personal goals with work goals. You can listen to people when they talk about their own goals, and this should allow you to find areas where their personal aims, their values, what's important to them, overlap that of the team or the organization, and that is what personally motivates them. And you can take this a step further if you can actually align activities to individual needs, wants, and values. Because we are all different, we have different personalities, we have different tastes and different motivations. And one of the traps we fall into is something that's really respected as the golden rule. You know, we've all heard that saying, treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. However, it's good manners, but it's not good motivation. And that's why using instruments like the Clifton Strengths Assessment as an example, or even the MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, it's so useful for individuals and for teams to learn more about our differences and how to use them in productive ways. So, little exercise for you now. I'd like you to rate your own autonomy at work. So how much, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being absolute freedom of choice and self-direction, and 1 being very little choice, rigid rules you've got to comply with. What is your level of self-direction? You don't have to share this. I just want you to do this for yourself and reflect on it. I'll ask for your reflections in a moment, your thoughts on this. But use a rating scale, 1 to 10. How is your own autonomy? What about mastery? The opportunities to learn and grow in your current role. Do you get that feeling of self-efficacy? Do you have the chance to stretch yourself so that you're developing that mindset of the growth mindset? And what about a sense of purpose? How strong is your sense of doing meaningful work that is really important, that relates to your personal motivation in terms of your sense of purpose, making the world a better place? So rate each of those 3 on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very high, 1 being very low, and keep that to reflect upon. If you've got any thoughts as you do that, love you to share them. And because this brings me to the end of my content today. We talked about the fact that before you even think about motivation, think about the person's needs, their basic needs. And Maslow does provide us a good, still useful model for thinking about people's needs. So when you're mentoring and when you're leading a team, think about, well, how are their basic needs being met? Because if they're not being met, you can, especially the most basic ones, you can expect counterproductive behaviors. Thinking about what gets in the way, what is blocking people, what are the barriers, what are the obstacles, and what helps them and what hinders them, because we need to do something about those, not kind of just individualize it and say, well, the person needs to be motivated. Well, what are the factors that prevent them from doing the things that we'd like to see? And then finally, those 3 drivers: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And hopefully you've now got a little picture snapshot of where you stand for yourself with those 3, and therefore gives you something to think about in terms of talking to your mentees or the team that you lead and making some differences there. So I'm very keen to, I'll stick around and answer any questions that you want to. We've only got a small group here today, so if you want to unmute and talk, or if you prefer, you can type in. You also might like to type in your key takeaways and actions. What are you going to do with this information that we've shared? Just a reminder, today's content came from the book Advanced Mentoring Skills, Taking Your Conversations to the Next Level. And I also want to remind you, and I will send out a reminder later today about the bonus webinar coming your way next week, this time next week, from Mentor City, talking about measuring the effectiveness of your mentoring programs and how to do that. So I'm going to stop the recording now and come back and answer your questions. So if you're watching the recording, thanks for being with us. If you're on live, stick around for questions, comments, and sharing.